Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. This is our first EPIP webinar of the 2015 year. We're actually co-producing this with our friends at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. The webinar is entitled Supersized, Imbalance, Post-2015 Election, What Foundations Should Know. I am your EPIP host for today's festivities, and we're joined by our very close friend and EPIP board member, Christine Reeves of NCRP. We have a ton of fantastic speakers and a lot of really interesting info to get to, so I'm not going to waste too much time. Just want to familiarize you all a little bit with EPIP. If you don't know too much about us, we're a national network of foundation professionals and social entrepreneurs who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. We're also an inclusive group of highly skilled and effective change makers committed to working together to build a just, equitable, and sustainable society. Beyond that, we attempt to provide a platform for our community to connect with others, learn and practice leadership skills, and voice emerging, transformative thoughts in the social sector. We're hoping to do a little bit of everything here today. If you are not an EPIP member, it's a great time to get involved. We have our national conference coming up in May, a ton of great webinars on the slate for the rest of the winter of 2015 and the spring of 2015. So great time to get involved. Reach out to me for more information. On that note, a couple of announcements quickly for us. We are hosting our national conference taking place in the wonderful city of New Orleans, Louisiana, May 13th and 14th. A lot more info on that to come, but if you're interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to us. Our next webinar is taking place on Wednesday, February 4th at 3 p.m. We'll be looking at Black male achievement, exploring systemic and capacity building solutions with a number of experts in the field, folks from Foundation Center, Open Society Foundations, Policy Link, CLASP. So please join us for that. And this month's Measuring a Leader's Skill is communications. Great time to host a local event, put together a blog post, share some of your thoughts with your friends. There's a lot to do there. And as usual for all events, please visit the epip.org website. And very quickly, just a couple of items for housekeeping. All attendees will be kept on mute. If you have any technical difficulties, audio issues, please use your question box. We'll be keeping an eye on that throughout. We're also saving time for Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, you can submit those via the question box as well, and we'll be taking a look at those throughout the broadcast. We are recording the webinar. A recap along with the slides and the webinar recording and some other resources will be made available on the EPIP website. And please help us out, help us improve our webinars, complete the post-webinar survey. So without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to my co-host, and as I said, our good friend Christine Reeves of NCRP. Christine, hang on one second. I'm going to make you the presenter, and you should have the opportunity to share your screen. Hi, Christine.
Great. Hi. Oops. There we go. Can you see my screen?
We can. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to be doing this webinar. We know that there's some chapters across the country, 13 chapters now watching this together as a group, as well as individuals who are friends of or somehow connected to NCRP or some of our great speakers today. So with that, today's topic to start off the new year is Supersized Imbalance, Post-2014 Election, What Foundations Should Know. And just to preface this before we jump in, this is a huge and complicated and complex topic, and we could easily provide content for an entire webinar series or an entire conference on this topic alone and still not thoroughly scratch the surface. Yet the scale of this topic is the reason why we wanted to plan a webinar about it. So for the purpose of today, we want to look at a few trends, results, and really great new tools related to how we can learn from and move forward post-2014 election, but doing so through the prism of philanthropy. Specifically, we want to catalyze a more robust conversation about elections and policy within the philanthropic community. A lot of times foundations try to be a neutral convener, which can be a good thing, but none of us, I hope, are neutral about hunger or neutral about illiteracy or neutral about access. So how can we be non-neutral by knowing what's going on in the political sphere? So no matter what issues that your foundation funds, the common denominator is that every cause and the people affected by those causes are connected to systemic policy implications. And today we're going to hear from 4 experts. And as they talk, think about how you and your foundation considers policy. Who are the winners? Who are the losers in certain situations? Who sits at the decision-making tables and who are left out? Who are most affected by problems, and are they recipients of charity, or are they empowered to help solve the problems? And how can we think of things, each of these topics that come up, by putting ourselves in others' shoes? How can we think of at least 5 sides to some of these complex issues and not just limit ourselves to 2 sides? And how can we apply different lenses, racial lenses, gender lenses, especially with everything going on in our society right now? So I'd like to just start with 2 quotes and 2 quick statistics before having an introduction of our speakers. And the 2 quotes are just thoughts that I often open with in my presentations. One is by Mary Jones, and she said, "My job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable." And in philanthropy, we all have a level of comfort. Quite frankly, people making more than $2 a day have a level of comfort because half the world can't boast that. So how can we afflict ourselves with more questions that can help us be better servants in philanthropy? And the second quote is by Archbishop Camara of Brazil, and he had said, "When I give people food, I'm called a saint, but when I ask why people are hungry, I'm called a communist." And it's just this idea of when we're afflicting ourselves with these tough, hairy, audacious questions, how can we make sure that although words matter, how can we make sure that we're not intimidated by any word? And last, I just want to leave you with 2 statistics. The first is 3 numbers, just to keep in mind throughout this presentation: 3 billion, 51 billion, and 70 billion. And 3 billion pertains to how much the Gates Foundation gives away each year, approximately. 51 billion is how much our entire philanthropic sector gives annually, and 70 billion is roughly the state of California's education budget alone between state and federal dollars. So that really puts in perspective how important policy and elections are, because philanthropy can't and shouldn't do it alone. So with that, let's start this really important and exciting conversation. So first, our first speaker is Edwin Bender, and he's the Executive Director of the National Institute on Money and State Politics. We also have Bert Brandenburg, who's the Executive Director of Justice at Stake, Tara Malloy, who is Senior Counselor at the Campaign Legal Center, and Daniel Stidd, who's the Director of the Madison Initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And finally, I'll be your MC for today, Christine Reeves at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, the nation's only watchdog organization for grant making, and I'm also on the National Board of EPIP. So for our time today, we're going to have quite a packed schedule. First, I'm going to just say a couple words on the framing of today. Then we're going to have Edwin talk about this incredible tool that he and his team have developed that whether you are a data wonk or not, I guarantee you'll be impressed. He will also give 2 examples. The first learning we'll talk about is related to fracking in an environment and who gives to influence policy. The second is on legislative action on a state level with a health policy example of ACA. Then we're going to transition to Tara Malloy, who's going to talk about to Bert Brandenburg, who's going to talk about judiciary independence and money in judicial elections and how philanthropy needs to know about that. And then we'll have Tara Malloy from the Campaign Legal Center talk about defending and enforcing campaign finance and what aspects of that philanthropy should be aware of. And then finally, we're going to hear from a foundation representative directly, and Daniel from Hewlett is going to talk about how election data informs how his foundation works. So with that, we're going to just, as each of the speakers talk, again, just consider the framing, consider who's involved, consider who might be missing, consider how your foundation might use the information that is being presented, and finally just think about the different lenses through which you could see this information. How might your grantees benefit from learning about some of these tools? How might your board members? How might the communities that you try to serve and empower? And what might be missing? How could we use a gender lens or a racial lens or any other type of lens to better understand and to have more empathy? And with that, we'll have a quick icebreaker just to gauge who is in the audience. And this is just a fun photo for that. So Michael, if you want to launch that quick question.
The poll has been launched, folks, so for those of you not looking directly at your screen, we'd love to learn why you joined today and what was your primary impetus for joining us? Are you regularly engaged in this kind of work, or are you just looking to learn more? We'll give you all a few more seconds and then share that info with the group. Looks like we're learning a lot about what you and your organizations are doing. All right, great. I'm going to close the poll and just share those results. It looks like 50% are regularly engaged kind of in political processes, and then about a quarter of you aren't regularly engaged, but looking to maybe rethink your approach, and another quarter are just new and looking to learn more, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some useful information for all of you.
Great, that's really helpful. So with that, I'm now going to ask Ed and his team to talk a little about this great tool that they have, as well as the environment and health example.
Great. Thank you, Christine, and welcome to everyone on the call. Just by way of background, over the past 15 years, followthemoney.org has compiled the most comprehensive and highly credentialed set of state-level political donor information in the country. We work with disclosure agencies in all 50 states to reduce barriers to public information. They help us acquire, process data for more than 100,000 reports filed by upwards of 16,000 candidates and committees from across the country. As we compile this enormous archive of information every election cycle, we continuously add value to it by cleaning up the data and adding complementary information, such as lobbyist names and clients. We invigorate the work of transparency advocates who are being innovative with our open source data, and the public, which has free access via the website, APIs, widgets to our comprehensive and verifiable information. In the end, we believe that we are changing the ecosystem of our democracy for the better. You can see all the different types of data that we've been compiling. And this is on top of the data. We're trying to put it in a context where you actually understand the reason for giving. So in the new website, and one of the examples I'll give here a little bit later, you will see that we're able to group the lawmakers by the legislative committees they sit on, and see who gave to those people, and see whether or not donors had an interest that was similar to the committee. We will be adding state legislation already very soon, so you will be able to look at a lawmaker, see who gave them money, and see what kinds of legislation they are introducing. Next slide, please. At a very macro level, our 40+ million records of data will tell you how much has been raised by gubernatorial candidates, how much is raised by House and Senate candidates in the states, how much has been given to ballot measure committees, and we also have party committee data that's not represented there. With numbers like these, you can start doing breakdowns. How much did gubernatorial candidates raise over multiple election cycles? What did winning gubernatorial candidates' numbers look like compared to losers, challengers versus incumbents? when you have the kind of data that we have, you're able to start doing some pretty amazing and very specific analysis about how money drives the power of the political process and how that correlates then into the public policy process. Next slide, please. So at a very basic level, our data tells you who gave, how much, to whom, and when, so that you, foundations, can help your grantees begin to answer the question, why were they giving money? And begin to understand the power dynamic behind that. Next slide, please. As we've developed our database, we've reached out to many different audiences, of course, and you can see them here. I'm a former journalist, and so the media is, of course, a top priority for us, and we are used regularly by some of the largest news organizations in the country, and I'm very proud to say by many of the smallest. We are invigorating with our open data a level of reporting that may not have been possible given the cutbacks in the news. So we are invigorating, we hope, a level of discourse around issues in the media and reporting that will help foster change. Scholars are using our data to study electoral processes. We've been used to analyze the public funding mechanisms or small donor campaigns. Advocates use our data a lot in many different ways on every issue. There's almost always a money and politics issue on any issue of the day. And you can see some of them that we've worked with. And we work with government agencies to try to better disclosure. Believe it or not, disclosure at the state level is not very good, and we are pointing out with our best practices work where it is good, where it's not, and working with the agencies to move that forward. Next slide, please. So data is nothing if it's not used, and our data, the kind of data we have, can be used to create an informed power map. So your grantees can begin to understand as they're moving into legislative sessions or they're trying to understand why something is moving through a legislative session. They can understand the players involved and start to analyze where the intersections with the people are, the lawmakers, and figure out strategies to step up and say, wait a minute, what about us? So next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. This is a good example of how we have worked with a foundation. The Energy Foundation came to us and said, there's a whole lot going on in the climate change policy world right now, and what can you do to help us? And we went out, created some special databases for them on lobbyist expenditures, and were able to show in California this example over a period of years how much was spent on lobbying by the energy producers as opposed to the environmental organizations. This was information that their groups were able to use because we have detailed data behind this that they can use then to inform their work as they're working in states to combat very specific pieces of legislation. Next slide, please. Now, if you use our website, this is what you would see if you were to go in and say, okay, I know fracking is an issue that is developing across the country, and it has been for almost a decade now. But there are a lot of policy implications right now: infrastructure, schools, roads, water, enforcement. And so here's us doing through followthemoney.org, a selection on oil and gas contributions to all candidates and committees for 2014 elections. You can see $40 million, over 17,000 records of data. Now, it's important to note in the upper right-hand corner where you see 86%, we actually go through and basically barcode every report we get so we know whether or not we have gotten all the reports at the end of the day. At this point, and this was updated January 7, we had 86% of the reports that were required to be filed, and there are 81% of the reports were required to be filed at the state. So this data is very complete, and that's important to note as you're trying to put in context how good is the data, should I use it or not. Next slide, please. when you have a big number like that, it's always good to put it in some context, and a bar chart is a very good way of doing that. This is the oil and gas across the country. Alaska, Texas are at top. Of course, nothing nothing exciting there, but you can see that you have Ohio, you have Pennsylvania, you have New Mexico, you have Wisconsin showing up. This is a way of understanding, where people are playing in this particular arena, and where you should start digging in a little deeper. And you can dig in deeper by going to that table viewer next to visualization options, clicking on that, and next slide. And if you clicked on table viewer and said view by contributor, this is what you'd get. These are the individual contributors, and we've standardized, we've aggregated them so that all the ConocoPhillips are all together. And this is a way of looking at who the major contributors in the oil and gas industry are, which states they're at, how many records they've given. And if you click on the magnifying glass on the left-hand side, you would then, next to ConocoPhillips, for example, you would go into their data, a new window would open, and you would be able to see who they gave to, whether they gave to candidates, party committees, ballot measures, and see the aggregate data, and even begin some analysis. How much went to incumbents, how much went to winning candidates, how much went to Republicans or Democrats or third parties. Next slide, please. And the issue of health care, of course, one of the largest issues in the country right now at all levels. You can go into our data, since our data going back to the 2000 election cycle is very robust. We're able to go in here and pick do a legislative analysis. This is healthcare contributions to Assembly, or House Assembly, and State Senate candidates, all states, all 50 states, for 4 election cycles. And you can see that the amount of money given has more than doubled. So this is a way of getting that macro view that says, wow, health is an issue, whether it's the Affordable Care Act, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare is an issue. This then starts giving you some pointers about where you should start diving in more. And again, here looking at data quality for our House and Senate data, these are our core pieces, our state data. The data is bomb-proof. Next slide, please. This is an example of working with a foundation, the California Endowment, as their grantees were looking at a lot of healthcare policy coming into California, a lot of campaign contributions coming in. We were able to go into our database, do some very specific analyses, and produce an infographic like this that their grantees were then able to use to bolster their arguments in the campaign. Next slide, please. So taking it step down, again, you can go from the macro level down to a very specific level on our database. Here we've selected out healthcare professionals who gave to winning candidates in the Senate in Washington State 2014. And there are 427 contributions totaling $200,000. Now again, there's the table viewer where you could go in and analyze this a lot of different ways, or you can just select on the display by contributor, and it will create that list. Next slide, please. And here is the list of contributors, the healthcare professional contributors who gave to winning state Senate candidates in Washington 2014. You can see we have the type of contributor. We do distinguish between actual people, who would be individuals, and non-individuals, who are PACs, corporations, that sort of thing. So you see here's the Washington State Dental Association at the top with 49 checks for $34,000, Washington State Medical Association. These are lists that you can sort, you can download. If you wanted to see, for example, the Washington State Dental Association's contributions, you could click on the magnifying glass and you would see that. And next slide, please. And here is that view. So here's the view of Washington State Dental Association contributions. You see the contributor to candidates on the left-hand side. And again, this is data that you can sort. If you wanted to sort by specific party, you could. If you wanted to sort by incumbency, you could. And at the bottom, you'll notice the data export, CSV, XML, and JSON. So this is an example of the data that you would be able to download, drop into a spreadsheet, and begin your own analysis if you needed to. We hope that we've created the kind of tools, if you create a My Follow the Money account, you can, which is free, you can go in and save your searches and save your data views. So you do not have to download and play in Excel. You can do most of the work, we hope, from our website. Next slide, please. Now, as I noted at the outset, getting from the data to a place where there's an intersection with power is our ultimate goal, and then moving out into the accountability world. This is an old tool. This was on our old site, but we are building this into the new site. It will be soon. But the functionality here that's important is we let you select a state, select a House or Senate committee. In this case, we've selected Senate committees for Washington State healthcare, and it shows you the list of who sat on in 2013 session in Washington, who sat on that committee, as well as their positions of power. It also shows you on the far right how much they raised in contributions total, and because you can filter this by the healthcare donors. You see where it says sector dollars. Those are dollars that came from donors who may have a healthcare interest. So this starts putting it in context. Our idea for this tool in the future, in the very near future, is to have a link to the legislation the sponsors or the lawmakers are introducing, and lower down where you have a list of who donated, which of the healthcare donors gave to these committee members, which of them have lobbyists. You can see on table 1 there that the insurance industry, health professionals is free at $67,000, pharmaceuticals $59,000, hospitals, nursing homes at $33,000. There's a table 3 to this view that we didn't put in here that would show you each of those donors. So Pfizer, for example, gave to 6 of the committee members. Pharma gave to 6 of the committee members, and you would actually see, you could click on the view record and see when those donations were made and whether and start understanding if there was a fundraiser or something like that, what kind of coordination there might have been. So with that, I will leave it. Next slide, please. And I will leave you with an invitation to please contact us. We pride ourselves on same-day service. My research staff is amazing, as is my acquisition staff, and we do everything we can to try to help people get the data they need to invigorate their discussions, their strategies, and be effective advocates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. And for you and your whole team, this is unbelievably impressive, and the heft that you have put together for drilling down so deeply into all these details that helps explain why things are happening at the policy level, and how that can affect philanthropy, because the size of a foundation grant really can't compare to the money that is in state and national and local politics. So thank you so much, and we're so glad you're able to share that with us.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is going to be Bert Brandenburg, Executive Director at Justice at Stake.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks EPIP, thanks NCRP. Happy Friday to all the attendees. First, I'll just say I'm proud to be the board chair of the Institute in Money and State Politics, where Ed runs the place, and it really is a phenomenal place. And as you can see, they've got phenomenal resources. I'm going to talk today in my capacity as Executive Director of the group Justice at Stake, which is one of the leading users of the Institute's data. And we focus, as Christine was mentioning at the outset, on fair courts issues, helping courts stay fair and impartial, with a particular focus on what's been going on around the country in judicial elections. Our honorary chair is Sandra Day O'Connor. We have a bipartisan board of directors. And we live in a country where, unbeknownst to a lot of us, even those who follow civic issues, something like 87% of our state judges have to stand for election during their careers. So electing judges and how you select them and what happens in those elections is very important for our system of justice. And a lot has been changing in what goes on in those elections in the last dozen years. And I'll sort of start off by talking about how we worked with a foundation some years ago, the MacArthur Foundation, as they were beginning to think about how they would be establishing a democracy program, and they were looking at the gamut of issues out there. And as we sat down with them, we explained to them that a lot of people in the democracy community will sometimes inadvertently think of the democracy challenges as a two-branch issue, and it's actually a three-branch issue. And when it comes to what's going on in the courts, obviously people care about whether the courts can deliver impartial justice. The courts have to protect our rights and provide access to justice. But in addition to that, every issue that any of you care about with the programs that you work on right now and that you care about as citizens are going to be issues that come before the courts. Every single issue that is important to every American will come through the courts, be it environmental, choice issues, crime, civil rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And our courts, unlike the other branches, are supposed to be the one place where everybody comes together with an equal shot. It's not supposed to depend on power and privilege. And what's been happening is that equation, which has been promised by the Constitution, due process under law, is being turned on its head by what's been going on in the last decade or so. And that's where the data really shows the story. If we can go to the next slide here. We've published a series of reports over the last decade plus, along with the Institute and the Brennan Center for Justice, that show that there's been an explosion in the amount of money pouring into judicial races. They used to be fairly quiet. Once in a while there was an expensive race, and now it's become systematic. And so as you see in this graph, this was just the explosion from 98 to 2000. That was kind of the big bang year for this issue. Since we've seen more than a couple dozen records smashed on the state side. If we can go to the next slide here. Well, I'll just keep narrating. There we go. And the money is really an arms race. If you were to stare at this pie chart for a little while, you would see that an enormous amount of it is the business community fighting it out with trial attorneys and the unions. And the business community has largely had the upper hand when you add together the last decade or so. What's interesting is that lately we're seeing some of the billionaires who've begun to play in politics, dipping their toes in the water of judicial elections. Americans for Prosperity, the Koch brothers group, has begun to show up with some checks in judicial elections as well. And this money, when you're a judge and you have to go out and raise this kind of money, you're typically raising it from people who appear before you in court. So there's a built-in conflict of interest with this, and this is a system that judges typically did not sign up for, and they feel trapped. And if we can go to the next slide, a lot of the research we've been able to do and the data we've been able to provide from Ed's group has shown that often it is concentrated from a few groups. And so you'll get situations where if you're a judge, you feel like a group that helped deliver an election or might deliver an election is going to put a lot of pressure on you if you don't rule their way. And the way this is, there was an example in last year's election where a North Carolina Supreme Court Justice named Sherry Beasley explained to the NPR affiliate down there that she had to use her early mornings and late evenings to actually write her opinions as a judge, which is supposed to be her job, because she had to save those precious daytime hours to go out and raise money from attorneys and at law firms. And again, a large amount of this money is being raised from people who then appear before the judges in court. There's not a whole lot of other people who would give money to a judicial election in the first place. And the money typically goes into TV ads, and if we can go to the last slide I have here, the ads are, judicial election ads get pretty nasty in a hurry, and they have nothing to do with what it takes to be a good judge. So if you read the caption here, this was out of Michigan, you had a woman whose son had been in the Middle East in the military, and she talks about how my son's a hero, he fought to protect us. Bridget McCormick, the woman who was running for justice in Michigan, volunteered to free a terrorist. How could you? She said to the screen. And Bridget McCormick had done work as an attorney on a pro bono basis in a way that any attorney often does, and was essentially, pinned to the wall for doing this. And these ads will, if you watch them, they have this sort of grainy images. They'll tell you that judges support terrorists and child molesters. They have clips of people dressed up in criminals' outfits thanking the judges for a lenient sentence, and essentially trying to portray judges as enemies of the state, and of course, taking court decisions and twisting them around. And this is what the money's going for. And just in the last year, we saw records smashed in states like Illinois and Tennessee, North Carolina, Montana. Missouri even had an enormous amount of money pour into a district court race from the Republican State Leadership Committee. Christine asked us to think a little bit about the lenses, and in terms of the racial lens, I guess I would say a lot of what's going on is obviously bad for the country and bad for every American, and I think it has special impact on racial minorities. Number one, it fuels a sense that there is two systems of justice, and that this problem obviously predates issues of judicial elections. It's a huge problem for our country, but it aggravates it. It further splits people into two camps, people who can afford good representation and afford to help elect judges, and those who can't, which is most everybody else. And in particular, if you're a racial minority or somebody who's in poverty, you're at the wrong end of the stick. Number two, it's having, as you might imagine, as I described with those criminal justice ads, an impact on criminal justice. Essentially, these ads ratchet up pressure on judges to, basically try to be punishers in every single case that they see. And we're seeing data now showing that judges are tilting towards prosecutors in states where more money comes in. It's actually affecting cases in the courtroom. Voting rights, a lot of voting rights issues come through state Supreme Courts, and therefore the pressure is felt on those judges as well. And then also what we call the new politics of judicial elections and the arms race is hurting efforts to promote diversity on the bench, because it crowds out minority candidates who may not be able to compete in the fundraising race if they even want to get a slot on the bench. I'll just close by talking a little bit about solutions. Number one is awareness, spreading word about the issue. When people hear about this, they tend to get concerned. This is where the Institute data has been so critical. Number two, promoting diversity in the bench is very important as part of the solution set in a lot of ways, but obviously a lot of this has to do with what to do about the way we pick judges. Our organization and a lot of others feel like the best approach is a system called merit selection, where you have a screening commission that helps pick the judges, a nonpartisan group that the governor can pick a candidate from. It's not a reform you can pass overnight, but it's a reform that is winnable, and we are underway. And the good news is that in the end, this is a bipartisan and nonpartisan issue for the electorate. Most people, regardless of party, want the courts to be above politics. Progress is possible, and it really was the philanthropic sector that helped us put this issue on the map by helping us get started up over a decade ago, getting the word out. We're moving forward, and that's thanks to the Institute and a lot of you from the philanthropic sector. So really pleased to be invited to be part of this, and thanks very much to NCRP and EPIP.
Thank you so much, Bert. And as you had just given an example of, through foundation support, you're able to bring awareness to this, to the public, to the nonprofit sector, to all sectors. And using a different lens, just thinking about, I truly cannot think of an issue that wouldn't be affected somehow by policy and by a court decision or by legislation, as you had mentioned. So just thinking about all the different types of capital that foundations have, their grant dollars that can support sharing this kind of data, their grant dollars that can help grantees who are trying to fight for something like this, reputational capital of how foundations with these really impeccable and well-earned reputations can bring people to the table to discuss these issues regardless of a grant, and onward and onward. So just thinking about this, but the last thing I wanted to mention is the idea of mission investing around this area in terms of where foundations invest their endowments, and if there's any endowment investment in companies that might be causing trouble in this space. So just to think about that as well. All right, so our next speaker, we have Tara Malloy from the Campaign Legal Center.
Hello, this is Tara. Thank you so much for having us. The Campaign Legal Center, that is, weigh in on this. Today I was hoping to focus, as some of the other speakers have, on elections, specifically on transparency in the financing of elections. The National Institute for Money and State Politics does a wonderful job of cataloging and all the information we have from disclosure laws. The Campaign Legal Center is focused on all the information that we do not, however, get from campaign finance laws, at least as they stand right now. So, I mean, really the idea is what happens when we don't know who is influencing policy, and what can we do about it? Specifically, I want to look at what has happened following the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United in 2010. Following the decision, we experienced not only a surge in independent spending by corporations, unions, and other outside groups, but also a dramatic decline in the disclosure provided in connection to such spending. As probably most of us experienced in the 2014 elections, there was a barrage of attack ads by outside interests, and those ads provided no more identification of the sponsors than various innocuous names such as Americans for Prosperity or Patriot Majority. Really all we knew is that they usually liked the word American or Patriot. This trend has not only reduced the transparency of our elections, but also presents challenges for groups pursuing substantive policy goals, such as perhaps many of the participants on this call. Advocates will have to adjust strategies for legislative change to take into account the influence wielded by outside spenders, and also the fact that often their identities are actually unknown, or at least the real parties and interests, the identities are unknown, and thus their interests to some extent obscured. The Legal Center is working to improve electoral transparency following Citizens United, pursuing multiple approaches involving both advocacy in the courts, advocacy before administrative agencies at the state and federal level, as well as before Congress and state legislatures. So I would just want to quickly outline the problem of the disclosure deficit and then maybe summarize some of the Legal Center's activities here. So to turn first to the decision in question, I guess we could go through 2 slides, please.
I don't believe we had slides from me.
Oh, really?
Okay. Was this yours?
No, here we go.
Oh, here it is. Oh, I thought these were Daniel's. Apologies, please.
No problem. No, that's the disclosure problem. And if we could go to the next slide, to Citizens United, which is the decision that started it all. So I see some of it didn't appear. As probably most of the participants on this call know, Citizens United was sort of a blockbuster decision that struck down the long-standing restrictions on corporate independent spending to influence federal elections. It's important to note that this was independent spending, or at least spending that should be independent, not direct contributions to candidates and political parties, which are often disclosed. The decision is less well known for the fact, though, that the justices, 8 of 9 at least, upheld disclosure laws at the same time as it struck down corporate spending restrictions. It was a very full-throated endorsement of disclosure. Unfortunately, following this decision, we've had anything but full disclosure. If we could change to the next slide. In the aftermath of Citizens United, as you can see, we saw a huge spike in spending. If you look at 2006, there was about $69 million in outside spending, that is so-called independent spending. And in 2010 midterm elections, the first elections following Citizens United, we jump up to $309 million, over 4-fold increase. Another trend was that this spending was not done necessarily directly by corporations or their counterparts unions. Even though they were relishing these newfound freedoms, we found that most of the spending was channeled through certain nonprofit groups organized under Section 501 of the Internal Revenue Code. So they were often using what we would less charitably term front groups, particularly these so-called 501c4 groups, which you probably heard mentioned of the media. These groups were attractive because they basically did not have to provide any disclosure of their donors, so one could hide the real parties and interests behind the advertising. And this is the quote-unquote dark money that we're seeing so much of in the last election cycles. So if we could change to the next slide. Here we have the biggest dark money groups in 2014, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Crossroads GPS, Patriot Majority on the left. These are all 501c groups that do not disclose their donors, and so we don't know anything about who's funding these ads except for these names that we have in front of us. If we could change to the next slide. Actually, let's skip this one to the next. So because so many of the new spending went through these nonprofit groups, we had a huge decline in disclosure. This chart shows that we went from 65% of spending disclosed in terms of the donors to only 41% in the pre-Citizens United presidential election and the post-Citizens United presidential election. This in some ways is not even as bad as it is. I mean, we basically went from about $69 million unaccounted for spending in 2008, that is where we didn't really know who was spending, to about $300+ million in 2012. So if we could change the slide again. So what were the reasons? I just started off the presentation by saying that Citizens United was a full-throated endorsement of disclosure. But the problem really was that federal law was simply not designed to capture this type of large-scale spending channeled through these tax-exempt nonprofit corporations. Tax law does not actually require these 501c groups to publicly disclose their donors, even if the group engages in explicit election advocacy. Groups can spend, such as 501c4 groups, can spend up to about 50% of their budgets on explicit election advocacy, but do not have to disclose who's financing it. Now, federal campaign finance law, you would think, would be the logical place to find disclosure, and in fact, the statute works pretty well, requiring all persons and groups that run electioneering communications to disclose all contributors of 1,000 or more. Unfortunately, however, this law, the statute, was gutted by a regulation adopted by the FEC in 2007. This rule requires a group running an election ad to disclose only those donors who quote-unquote earmark their money for an election ad. Unsurprisingly, perhaps donors are far too sophisticated to earmark or say explicitly what they want their money for, and therefore these groups running millions of dollars of election ads basically disclose nobody at all. So here we have the deficit of disclosure. What is the effect on policy change? Well, as we all know, big money in politics is nothing new. What is new, however, is the size of the outside expenditures and their anonymity. Thus, an advocate must take into account, one, the possibility that legislators are indebted to certain outside groups due to this independent advertising, and two, the fact that the identity of the funders of these groups are likely to be secret. So, for example, a state advocate for or against an environmental regulation will have to contend with the fact that a legislator is not only concerned with the views of his constituents, or even his direct donors, which are disclosed, but also with the outside groups that may have waged war or bolstered his candidacy. Further, as we've been discussing, because of the failure of the disclosure laws at the federal level and often at the state level, an advocate might not even really know who the funders of these groups are and does not really know the parties and interests behind the outside advertising campaigns. A real-life example of how difficult it is to understand the subterranean world of influence is that of the insurer Aetna. In the 2011-2012 election cycle, the insurer Aetna gave more than $3 million to a 501c4 group, the American Action Network, and another $4.5 million to the Chamber of Commerce. We only know about these contributions because they mistakenly included them in a filing with an insurance regulator. This is not something that had to be disclosed under the current campaign finance laws. Both of these nonprofits spent millions of dollars attacking lawmakers who voted for the Affordable Care Act. And ironically, at the same time, Aetna's president publicly voiced support for the same legislation. So we have a situation where legislators are probably going to be influenced by these type of campaigns or advertising campaigns. At the same time, we don't even know who's financing them, and their public positions might be very different than their private spending decisions. So that, in a nutshell, what do we have here? We have a huge surge in independent spending. We have very little disclosure of a large majority of such spending, or at least a part of such spending. At the same time, we have the problem of trying to, or people have the problem of trying to advance change without really even knowing who is influencing who because of this deficit of disclosure. So I just want to end quickly by looking at the activities of the CLC to try to improve the situation. We see disclosure as the first step for passing meaningful campaign finance reform. And in a broader sense, I think that this type of disclosure is necessary as a first step in the pursuit of any substantive policy goals to even know what the interests are that one is dealing with. We were supporters of legislative change, such as the Disclose Act. That was a congressional bill that would have greatly improved transparency in the spending in the independent sector. That did not go anywhere, which then shows us that we have to pursue a very multi-pronged strategy. We then advocate in the courts. We do affirmative litigation. Actually, we could change the slide too, sorry. To move to this second part, we do affirmative litigation. We have, for instance, sued the FEC to try to get the court to vacate this 2007 rule that gutted the existing campaign finance laws, which were not perfect, but were all right. We've had some success there where a district court has basically struck down the FEC's rule and said that it was improper implementation of the statute and was far too narrow in terms of the disclosure it provided. So that is another route that we've pursued. We've also pushed the IRS and the FEC to better enforce their regulations or to change their regulations. One example is that we often push the IRS to better regulate the 501c groups that are under their jurisdiction. And indeed, not probably because of the Campaign Legal Center, but in 2013, they began a rulemaking to better clarify the rules under which 501c4 groups have to operate. And finally, we are engaged in a lot of defensive litigation. At the same time that Citizens United indicated Supreme Court support of disclosure, we've seen a massive tidal wave of cases challenging state and federal disclosure laws. probably we're talking about 3 or 4 dozen lawsuits. So the Legal Center is very, very active trying to defend the existing campaign finance laws on the books, even while we recognize that they are far from perfect as they stand. So that's a brief description of what we are doing and why we think it's important for all groups engaged in policy change, and certainly happy to answer any questions as we go forward. Thank you.
Great, and thank you so much, Tara, for not just your presentation, but all that you're doing with your team at the Campaign Legal Center. And one of the things that just came to mind, putting myself in the shoes of a program officer at a foundation or evaluation officer, is a lot of what philanthropy is able to do with its resources, in addition to other areas we talked about earlier, is evaluation and coming up with methods that can move the needle and all these other good things towards positive results. But one thing that can be helpful when thinking about evaluation is what are grantees up against, no matter how many resources that they have or what options are out there. If they're trying to promote an environmental victory but are completely outgunned in terms of the funding that they have compared to all that's going into campaign finance. So thank you for that. And finally, we are going to hear from Daniel Stid, who runs the Madison Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation. Daniel?
Thank you, and thank you to the emerging practitioners in philanthropy and the National Committee on Responsive Philanthropy for supporting this webinar. We're glad to take part, and I also want to acknowledge the great work that the National Institute for Money and State Politics, Justice at Stake, and the Campaign Legal Center are doing. We're very glad to be funders of the National Institute and the Campaign Legal Center and the work that they do, and while we don't fund in the judicial elections area that Bert works in, we really admire what his organization has done and the impact that they've had. And I want to start by acknowledging the work of the frontline advocates and organizations, just because as a foundation, what impact we have is largely derived from what the organizations that we're supporting are able to do. And as we think about our strategy, it's kind of one level up, a bit more removed from the fray. And as you can see from our graphic here, I think the cartoon captures the dynamic which we're most concerned about, which is basically the intense conflict, the polarization and the hyperpartisanship that currently exists between our two parties, and the extent to which that really grinds our system of separated and checked and balanced power, which wasn't meant to host that kind of intense party conflict to a halt. And so in particular, we're trying to enable Congress and its members to be able to negotiate and compromise in ways that work for the American people, not because people want to compromise necessarily, but because for our system of government to work, they really have to. And I think one of the things that we're aware of, and given that there's a number of funders on the phone, is the extent to which, however inadvertently, philanthropy itself is implicated in this polarization. I think one of the things that over the years that philanthropy has gotten very good at is funding advocates who are participating in the public debate, and that's a fine and appropriate use of philanthropy. And you see both from, starting back in the 60s with the work that the Ford Foundation was underwriting, to the work in the 70s and 80s that a number of conservative foundations did, and kind of a counter to that, to the counter mobilization that's occurred to where we are today, where there's a philanthropic network aligned with the Koch brothers and conservative funders on the right, and a liberal or progressive network of funders aligned with the Democracy Alliance on the left. We've got kind of these two constellations of philanthropy and political funders trying to pull the system to one side or another, which I think is basically working as a byproduct of that to accelerate the polarization. So one of the things we're trying to do is basically strengthen the institution, in particular the institution of Congress, that our society has to represent and reconcile the different points of view. And to be clear, we think different points of view are good. That's a feature, not a bug of our system, as we say out here in Silicon Valley. So one of the things that we do when we think about elections is just what actually are the electoral preferences being revealed. And in a democracy, presumably, public policy needs to be oriented around those elections. If we could go to the next slide, here you'll see this is a map the vote for the House of Representatives in the 2014 elections. And I think it's what you see here is a pretty stark picture that you have basically a red hinterland, a rural hinterland, and blue urban and coastal enclaves. And I think there are generally in those places pretty different conceptions of prevailing about the role of government, the public policies that are responding to people's problems, and the fact that you have increasingly distilled geographic differences, not necessarily along state lines, but along a rural or an urban line, is really sharpening this polarization. And I think what that just brings home to us, that if you have basically roughly half of the country in the blue enclaves and half the country in the red hinterlands, and they generally, people in those places are generally leaning towards one side or the other in terms of what government should be doing, that we need to find some way of reconciling it. Now, I think a lot of times funders, especially on the progressive side, will say, well, that's all just a result of Republican gerrymandering, when in fact it's much more a function of how we've been sorting ourselves. Probably in aggregate at the national level, there's a handful of seats that the Republicans won due to gerrymandering in places like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Texas. But it's a net effect because there's states like Illinois and Maryland, and even out here in California, where we have ostensibly a nonpartisan system where Democratic majorities and parties have been able to secure more House seats than would have been their fair share in a neutral system. So I think you also, if you think about the Senate, where of course gerrymandering isn't an issue now, Republicans holding the bulk of the Senate seats. At the governor's level, 29 gubernatorial seats. So the long and short of this, the upshot of the electoral results for us is the extent to which we need to premise our work on the fact that this is a deeply divided country. No one side is likely to get the upper hand anytime soon, and there are real and important differences that need to be reconciled across the electorate. If you go to the next slide, this takes us down to the state level. Here you can see, as it comes up, the control of state legislative action. So I think this is another area that underscores the need for compromise. The red states are one where the Republicans have united control of government, the governor's offices, and the two state houses. The blue states are where the Democrats have unified control, and the gray states are where it's split. Now, what's interesting here is, in half the states in which 48% of people are living, the Republicans have unified control of the state government. And so therefore, when we think about policy at the federal level that needs to be administered and implemented to the state level, as in the case with healthcare and most environmental policies, having a partisan approach, even if you could secure a partisan approach at the federal level, but that ultimately needs to be implemented with and through the support and direction of state and local officials who happen to belong to the other party. I think it, to us, in our mind, this further underscores the need for compromise solutions. Again, not because people want to do it or that's always the best, but because it's really necessary to make the system of government that we have work. So this is just to give you a quick Cook's tour of the basic group facts as we see them in the electorate that we're trying to respond to. So I guess with that, I know there's a few minutes left. I'll turn it back to the group for any questions.
Great. Thank you to each of you so much for spending some time with us today and also for what you do. We highly encourage folks to check out the EPIP website afterwards in order to find out more information about all four of our speakers' organizations. And due to time constraints, if someone has a really quick question they want to type in, please do so. We might be able to follow up offline. But I thought I might close with just a question that any of the panelists could answer if they wish without putting any one of them on the spot. And to sort of couch this question, I thought I'd share two data points from the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy's work. So we recently did a Philanthropic Landscape Report, which tracks 1,100 of the largest U.S.-based foundations. And we found that the percentage of grant dollars from those 1,100 foundations that go towards supporting social justice or social change, which we define as civic engagement, what we're talking about today, advocacy, community organizing, voter participation, or work for structural change in order to increase the opportunity of those who are least well off politically, economically, and socially. So of the 1,100 largest foundations, the percentage of grant dollars going towards those activities from those foundations is just 12%. And if you can imagine only 12% going towards direct service, that would be really surprising. And when you couple that with another NCRP study showing over 3 years, 110 nonprofits tracked, and the 300 funders who funded them, for every $1 that they got in grant dollars, they had a $115 return on investment. Things like a prison on track to be built in Portland wasn't needed because there was such a drop in prison recidivism, things like that. So with all of this in mind, I was just wondering if any of the presenters could give any advice to, let's say, a program officer who isn't currently working in the policy space on the arts or environment or hunger, whatever issue they might be working on. How might they talk with their colleagues about considering some of this policy and election work in their day-to-day jobs or with their grantees or at a staff meeting? What might be helpful internally at a foundation in order to start thinking about the topics that we went through today, if any of you have any thoughts?
Well, I could just add that I think if you care about an issue, the way politics is evolving, it's no longer a luxury to care about the politics of the issue. It's now inseparable if you care about progress to care about the politics of progress. Progress is only made when people, play. Politics has evolved in a way that being on the sidelines often means just not winning.
Yeah, that idea of advocating for change or silently advocating for the status quo. Any other thoughts of, we know you can certainly go to Ed's website and gather a lot of information, and not just for your foundation, but for your grantees. Any other thoughts from our speakers today about how someone not really involved in this space could start?
Yes, this is Tara Malloy. I just wanted to point out that, I work with many people in the field of campaign finance, and what is interesting is that many came into the field of campaign finance from a different policy issue. They cared about the environment or free trade or poverty, and they realized that they were not affecting legislative change, and they realized that you could not simply pursue a policy goal, that you had to understand the process of how legislation gets made and who's influencing who. And so it's funny that campaign finance, the portal to campaign finance is often substantive policy issues, and I think it works the other way around, that if you're trying to pursue policy change, as many are, that one has to have an understanding of how elections are financed and how influence is bought and sold.
I'll just jump in here to say that I'd be happy to forward to the webinar organizers. It sounds like there'll be a follow-up mailing or website link available. We've developed, at Hewlett, as we've developed our strategy, what we've referred to loosely as a systems map, which tracks what we see as the key variables that need to be addressed in the system, the relationships between them, and also where and how we have grantees that are working to improve them. And we'd be happy to share that in case it's of interest, along with the set of sources and data that we use to develop it, in case that would be helpful to people on the phone. And would also welcome feedback. We aren't presuming that we have this all figured out, and we've been trying to share and be transparent about how we're seeing the world so we can get constructive guidance on how to improve that. So I'll make sure that resource is available to the group.
That would be great. Thank you. So any other thoughts? Oh.
Yeah, I would only reiterate what others have said, is that if you don't show up, you can't have a say in the policy, and the people who are showing up are having a very large voice, and our data shows that. And so you can use our data to show who the players are, who you're going to be talking in opposition to, or who's going to be talking to a lawmaker, and whose argument you're going to have to be able to counter. And so you can use the data that we have in a very specific way to be a much more effective advocate. And there is almost no issue that's before a public issue that does not have a campaign finance angle. It may not be a big one. It may not be the a business making a policy change so its bottom line can be more stable or grow. But there is almost no issue that does not have a campaign finance angle that cannot inform advocates and help them be more effective.
Great. Well, thank you to Ed Bender from the National Institute on Money and State Politics, Bert Brandenburg from Justice at Stake, Tara Malloy from the Campaign Legal Center, and Daniel Stidd from the Hewlett Foundation. We greatly appreciate you sharing your wealth of knowledge, and we encourage all the foundations and foundation-related organizations who have staff members listening in to continue pursuing this work. We want to thank you for being a part of it today, especially the chapters who are gathered together to watch the webinar as a group. Please continue to be in touch, and we look forward to having you participate in our February, and I think there's another January webinar to come. Thanks so much, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.